Hello, I'm Michael Catania, Chair of the New Jersey Natural Lands Trust. In 2012, Hurricane Sandy had a devastating impact on families and communities along the New Jersey shore. The storm also destroyed critical coastal habitat for wildlife. An example of this was the near total destruction of a handful of Delaware Bay beaches that host an amazing annual natural phenomena: the spring horseshoe crab spawning and shorebird migration. Each May, thousands upon thousands of horseshoe crabs lumber in from the deeper waters off the continental shelf to spawn on just a handful of beaches along the Delaware Bay. After mating, female crabs lay millions of eggs in shallow nests on sandy beaches. And each year, several species of migratory shorebirds make an incredible round-trip journey from wintering grounds near the southern tip of South America to breeding grounds in the high Arctic, stopping on these same beaches to gorge on these horseshoe crab eggs and refuel for the remainder of their long flight. Thus, the very survival of these amazing birds that weigh mere ounces is tied to the availability of this unique food source found only on these beaches. Life is tough enough under the best of circumstances for red knots, ruddy turnstones, semi-palmated sandpipers, and a number of other migratory shorebird species. Coastal development, disturbance by other species like humans and dogs, and overharvesting of horseshoe crab eggs for use as bait by eel and conch fishermen have all helped to push these species to the brink of extinction. Hurricane Sandy did not help. While rising sea levels from our changing climate and normal storms already caused these beaches to migrate inland, Sandy accelerated the process significantly, essentially washing the sand either out to sea or so far inland that there was virtually no place where the horseshoe crabs could lay their eggs. And no horseshoe crab eggs mean no refueling station for migratory shorebirds, threatening the very survival of these species. Fortunately, a number of stalwart organizations launched an unprecedented rescue effort. This partnership included nonprofit foundations, state and federal wildlife agencies, conservation and environmental groups, academic institutions, and concerned individuals. The project to rebuild the Delaware Bay beaches was a massive undertaking in a short period of time, but the gamble paid off. The Conserve Wildlife Foundation of New Jersey, Greener New Jersey Productions, and the Delaware Riverkeeper Network documented on video the restoration work that took place on the Delaware Bay shore during the spring of 2013 in a race against time.
It changed the shape of the bay when Superstorm Sandy devastated the Jersey Shore in the fall of 2012. It also stripped the sand off the beaches along the Delaware Bay.
It's the worst it's been. I've been working on the bay since the early 80s, and this is the worst it's been. It's taken away. We estimated on an aerial survey about 60-70% of all the good habitat.
For years, people who live along these remote beaches have been fighting a mostly losing battle against sea level rise and erosion.
If you look at a lot of the towns that are sporadically located along the bay shore, you'll see that many of the streets that once may have had large buffers, we might have had yards with a gorgeous view of the bay, are now you see the houses are half underwater, or the house is basically right where the tide comes in.
On March 18th, work began on a $1 million project to restore these beaches, which are part of the ecosystem that's home to the largest horseshoe crab population in the world. The first truckload of sand was delivered to Kimball's Beach. By the time the work was complete, 1,800 truckloads of sand were added to a little less than a mile of beachfront. Biologists had about 7 weeks to get the work done. That's when the horseshoe crabs would begin coming ashore to spawn and lay their eggs.
Yeah, we're trying to beat the Mother Nature's clock here, because the crabs are going to come in and spawn very likely at the end of April this year, because the bay's water is warmer than normal, and so that the crab spawning in part depends on the water temperature. So we have to get the beach in shape before the crabs start to spawn. And so one of the things we're trying to do, and I think we're going to be successful, is get the sand on before the spring tides of early April. Spring tide is when the high tide is higher than normal, and just because of the moon. In effects of the moon. And so we want that spring tide to wash over our work so that it'll settle things down, make it conform to the natural contours of the beach, and maybe change the density of the sands, make them more aerated.
We're really up against the hard biological clock of the crabs. We need to get the beaches ready before they come back ashore to do their annual spawning.
A coalition of conservation groups, government agencies, and funders came together to undertake this project.
I mean, this is a tremendous effort with lots and lots of moving pieces. We have 4 principal organizations doing the conservation work. We had to get funding both nationally and locally from corporate partners. We had to get permits from the Army Corps of Engineers, from the state of New Jersey, permission from all the landowners to come and do the work on the beach. So it's been a tremendous effort. And the fact that we've done it all within the space of about a month and a half is also a testimony just to the fact everybody's pulled together and gotten this thing going.
When Superstorm Sandy took a bite out of these beaches, she unearthed old pilings and other debris. Decades of failed attempts to hold back the bay waters. The Cape May County Mosquito Control Commission was called in to remove the structures.
The debris, there's debris on all Delaware Bay beaches because people have been trying to live on Delaware Bay for generations and failing.
We estimate probably in the neighborhood of, say, 40 tons of material, which would include concrete, bricks, and then also the pilings and wood involved.
Is that a lot for an area this size?
That's a good question. I don't have that much experience to know that that's a lot or not. It seems like a lot to me for a small area like this.
One beach where the old bulkheads created a serious problem for the crabs is at Pierce's Point.
Prior, they were blocked by the wooden structures that are parallel to the beach, ones that run right along the beach edge, so crabs couldn't migrate up. Right now, because of the hurricane, they've been broken. So now the crabs can get over them and probably might get trapped on the way out. So they're now more of a crab trap. So that's why we want to sort of get some of the structure out in time for the horseshoe crabs.
Creating the new beaches involves more than just plowing the sand into place. Officials from the Coastal Research Center at Richard Stockton College are setting the boundaries for the project.
So what this is doing is we're setting the elevation grades for the slope that the contractor is going to fill to. So the orange mark down at the bottom is the elevation of the sand he's going to push to. This is at this end of the fill, we're near what we call the taper. So we're at basically where the fill is coming to an end. And if there's a stake back there, when he gets back to that point, he won't be putting any additional sand there at all. So from here on out is where the majority of the sand is going to be placed. It's called RTK GPS system. It uses what's called a smart network to locate itself with the satellites. So we get real-time corrected information. It's accurate to about a centimeter elevation and horizontally.
After the sand is delivered, some quality control work is conducted.
Grain size, it's supposed to be we have a design plan for the size of the sand on the beach so that it benefits the horseshoe crabs most, and we're confirming that what we contracted for is what we're getting.
And so I'm going to take, there's a different color here. This from the more local source, a little finer. So I'm going to take a sample, a composite, and these go to a DEP certified lab, a local lab that does all the analyses too for the Atlantic side restorations. And the Army Corps will require the same type of testing about every 3,000 cubic yards, just to make sure. Though the probability sometimes that you hit a pocket in a gravel pit that the grain size is kind of funky, then those are the trucks we would turn around, but none of that's happened on this project. We know both suppliers very, very well.
Biologists want to make sure the material will be suitable when the female horseshoe crabs lay their eggs.
An optimal habitat would be somewhere, grain size would be about 0.6 to 0.8 millimeters the median grain size would be 0.6 to 0.8 millimeters. So that's what we were trying to shoot for. Now, we had historic data from Reed's Beach and other beaches so that we could look at what the native grain size was, and that was more in the region of 0.3 to 0.5. So we're trying to do the best we can to find that sweet spot between the available sand we have, what's optimal, and what's native, so that we could make this habitat the best it could be. What they're looking for, they have chemoreceptors on their legs, which help them determine if there's peat very close to where they're laying their eggs. You don't want anoxic mucks and hydrogen sulfide coming up and causing problems for the eggs. So they're trying to lay their nests where it's well oxygenated, there's no peat very close to the surface that might hamper egg development. And that's what crabs are doing. Now, when other crabs come up, they unearth the nests of previously laid eggs by other crabs, so that's what brings the eggs to the surface for shorebirds, as well as wave action and other things. But they call it bioperturbation, which is a fancy word for another crab digging up your eggs.
A few miles to the north, another key area for restoration work is Moores Beach, where a resort town once stood. It's now a wildlife management area.
So now what we're trying to do is get rid of all the pilings, all the rubble that people would put on the beach to protect from erosion. And then we're going to lay down a new bit of sand here to try to restore it back to horseshoe crab breeding. But I think once we get this back in its natural condition again, get rid of all the pilings and the rubble and all that, everything will be able to move more easily. And if we add sand to the system, then we think it'll come back to its past value to horseshoe crabs and shorebirds.
But crews face another hurdle. They can't do any restoration work until huge potholes in the road leading to the beach are filled.
So we got to fix every one of those potholes. We counted them, there's 42. And these are, tractor trailer size potholes, so it's not a little job.
To help improve spawning areas for the crabs, biologists are working with local watermen to set up an oyster reef just off Reed's Beach. The idea is to see if the reef can reduce the wave action.
And so the goal is to create some quiet water, because we're finding that over the years that the horseshoe crabs tend to spawn heavily in quiet water at the creek mouths. Shoals form at the creek mouths, landward of the creek mouths is kind of quiet water, and they spawn very heavily there. So this is an idea that, well, do they spawn just because it's quiet water? Can we quiet the water by creating a structure out there, and will they spawn in higher numbers there? And the other is, can we do it in a way that benefits a commercial industry, so oyster growing, and thereby, if it does work, other oystermen might take this on as saying, okay, I can do this, it's productive, I can grow more oysters here, and it's also helping the horseshoe crab, so it's sort of more of a self-sustaining, economically viable solution.
What we want to see through this part of the project is just how much of a buffer that creates, just how much of a protective shelter it creates. Is it minimal, or is it significant enough that we should use this pilot to further expand the reefs along the coast?
As March fades away, Kimball's Beach, Cook's Beach, and Reed's Beach are transformed. The crews are working to push the new sand down to the low tide mark. Spring rolls into the bay, the water's warm, and the horseshoe crabs begin their slow march ashore to begin spawning. Their eggs provide the food source for red knots and thousands of other migrating shorebirds.
There was a lot of coordination involved. You had multiple public and nonprofit agencies here that needed to work closely together. Fortunately, there are individuals in each of those organizations that know each other well, that work together well, that were more than willing to put everything else aside and work together to make this happen. It's really a phenomenal accomplishment when you think of, in really about 2 months, a 6 to 8 week period, they were able to remove the rubble from these beaches, to restore the sand, truck sand in, and get ready for the shorebirds and horseshoe crabs.
As the coalition watches the success of this project, there is concern over a call by some to lift New Jersey's ban on harvesting horseshoe crabs for bait. The moratorium was enacted after over-harvesting of the crabs caused a steep drop in the population.
We have a crab population that's at a very low level still. and doesn't show signs of recovering. But now with these habitat losses, we're talking about reduced carrying capacity for that population. So increasing a harvest right at the time the population has lost a major component of habitat is a big mistake. Lifting our moratorium and allowing harvest to continue is really irresponsible in my view.
I think it's way too early for that. Crab population has not rebounded. It's still at relatively low levels. And frankly, the economics and the ecological issues are too important. We need to either find a substitute bait for conch and eel for people to use, but what's important right now is that the very survival of a handful of these species are at stake.
If we allow the crabs to be exposed to harvest too soon, we are jeopardizing the health of the whole bay ecosystem, the natural elements of it, but also the human connection to the Delaware estuary, the bay, the horseshoe crabs, the biomedical industry, the ecotourism industry, and everything that depends upon a healthy horseshoe crab population.
Now that the horseshoe crabs have returned, so have the red knots and thousands of migrating shorebirds. They are feasting on the crab eggs.
Which are just these lipid-rich packets that birds just knock back, gain a lot of weight, a lot of energy very quickly.
Biologists and volunteers capture the birds, place ID bands on their legs to track their migration, collect other data, and blood samples.
But actually getting to hold a bird in your hands and know like that this little tiny thing with a really fast beating heart came from what is basically the other end of the globe is phenomenal, and then watching it fly away when you let it go.
Small geolocators have also been placed on about 300 red knots to follow the birds' movements.
This tells us where they're actually going without any human understanding. And so we're discovering new stopovers. We discovered a new stopover in Hudson Bay that almost every bird is going to, but nobody had seen it, has been there before. We found new wintering areas. So these are very important data.
A drop in the horseshoe crabs has also caused a severe decline in the red knot population that depend on the crab eggs. In September, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service proposed Endangered Species Act protections for the red knot.
You know, the pressure is on, the pressure is built every year, and that endangered species designation is really vital for ensuring that the red knot population doesn't tip over the edge and fall into the morass that is extinction. We need to list the red knot today so we can get in place the critical protections we need to ensure that they do not, in fact, become extinct.
The number of red knots counted this spring compared to last year was about the same, but still low from their historical figures. Researchers are also worried about other migrating shorebirds, such as ruddy turnstones. Their numbers are also declining. Horseshoe crabs also play an important role in protecting human health. An extract of the crab's blood is used by the pharmaceutical industry to ensure that their products are free of bacterial contamination. Monitoring the effectiveness of this project continues months after both horseshoe crabs and the migrating shorebirds have left the bay. Researchers have placed mesh bags in the sand on Moores Beach to collect horseshoe crab eggs.
This was once 20 centimeters below the sand, but now it's above the sand. And we're hoping to look for patterns. If there are variations in the egg development, we're hoping to look for patterns in whether it's the sand grain size, moisture content, different variables that we can look at to try to improve restoration efforts in the future, to try to really dial in on what the best habitat components are for these horseshoe crabs. We'll take a look at how they developed, and I can see already there's lots of hatched horseshoe crabs in this sample.
Digging deeper, there are some encouraging signs.
Developed horseshoe crab eggs. Yeah, these are just about to hatch out of their eggs. So over time, the little green egg gets bigger and bigger, and then becomes clear, and then you can actually see the little larvae swimming around in there, the little embryo, and then eventually they'll come out of that there and be little horseshoe crab little baby horseshoe crabs.
Researchers say the egg counts were about the same as last year, and that's a positive sign considering the damage to these beaches. A lot has been written about this area and its significance in the natural world. The full-time residents have a connection to the sublime character of this place.
Look at the tranquility here, and it's the most gorgeous sunsets. It is just, I come down here and we de-stress.
The project has made some noticeable improvements for those who enjoy these beaches.
Oh, I think it's absolutely beautiful because there was a lot of debris. It's beautiful. It's so nice to walk this beach now.
This effort also includes a social marketing and outreach component.
Delaware Bay is really an area of hemispheric, even global importance, and yet the people who live around these communities may not have learned that yet. And so what we're trying to do is build a pride, a sense of place among these communities, among the people who live here, so that they understand their value in the big scheme of things for this amazing phenomenon, and that understanding benefits their own quality of life, so that they gain from living and protecting this resource that is so important at a global scale.
The horseshoe crab shorebird phenomenon helps bring in more than $11 million to the local ecotourism industry.
So, there are access points where people can come out and see one of the greatest, juxtapositions of living things on the planet, right here in New Jersey.
Coalition members who worked on this project are also monitoring how well the replenished beaches are holding up against the tides. There has already been some erosion.
It's not a surprise. Beach restoration is a challenge. You can't get the sand and the sediment to stay where you want it to go and in the profile you want it to be.
Researchers say sea level rise and an increase in storm intensity will likely cause more severe erosion along New Jersey's beaches. That will probably require more work such as this in years to come in order to protect the horseshoe crabs and the shorebirds.
I mean, they're up against all sorts of pressures and stresses, and climate change is aggravating that because it's influencing the loss of the habitat, which obviously undermines the strength of the population. So we're trying to adapt to climate change. We're trying to make sure that the crabs have all the advantages we can provide them, and then by extension the birds have all the advantages that a healthy crab population can give them.
So I believe this is a project we will have to revisit over time, with continued monitoring, continued rebuilding of the beaches with filling and restoration projects.
Actually, the whole bay, this whole ecosystem is so special and such a treasure, and it's really one of New Jersey's gems.
Despite this spectacular accomplishment, the battle is not over. Climate change and more severe storms are still a threat to these beaches. But for now, let's focus on the positive and listen to the comments of several of the funders who joined us on the beach for a day of tagging shorebirds. You'll see how moved they were by the physical strength and courage of the small birds they held in their hands.
This was a very gratifying project to fund because we could see the results immediately of where the funding support from the foundations was going. It had a very short timeline. We knew that the groups that were working to restore these beaches had a very short window of time to actually get down in here and do it before the horseshoe crabs and the red knots and all the migratory birds were coming up. So we had to act fast, and it was an opportunity to fund a project that would have some real immediate tangible results.
You got to take part in banding a red knot. You held a red knot.
Yes.
What was that experience like?
Well, these tiny little birds that you hold in your hand, and you realize that they're flying from the tip of South America up to the Arctic, and that this is their one stopover point, that this is their rest stop on their journey. And when they get here, they have to have a good source of food and high calorie intake in order to get them on their second leg of the journey, which is up to the Arctic. So it's amazing to see these little birds. You can't imagine this tiny creature making that long distance journey. It's really quite incredible. This was a real great example of how philanthropy, private philanthropy, government programs, and nonprofit organizations can come together and really affect some good on-the-ground projects.
One of our strategies, in addition to providing support for protection of specific places, is to build the interest of people in the resource that we're trying to protect. And because of the international or hemispheric significance of the Delaware Bay shore and the migration, this seemed like a project that touches so many people in so many places that it really becomes high profile and something that helps people to understand the value of the Delaware Bay and its system. Thinking about protecting the watershed, we're interested in thinking strategically about what the most significant ecological places are within the watershed, and of course a lot of that has to do with protecting forested headwaters, but it also has to do with protecting the richness and diversity of the Delaware Bay, which is such a significant part of the system. Holding the red knot, I think it's emblematic of the delicacy of the system, but the resilience as well, because the holding the bird, it just was so small and fragile, but so resilient. So it's sort of an interesting emblem of what the whole system is.
So after Superstorm Sandy, we wanted to do something to help both New York and New Jersey rebuild in a smarter way. So we were pleased to provide some funding to the New Jersey Recovery Fund, because that's exactly what the fund will do. It's not just help with immediate relief operations, but long-term recovery. And we were thrilled to have some of our funding go towards a project like this, which is really restoring some key beaches for these species. To actually see a project that literally replaces habitat that's absolutely critical to a species persisting is actually very tangible, very real for us. Well, this project's unique for what we funded to date, because you literally have a species that could wink out if these beaches were not replaced in time this year. And so we fund various projects, many of which are restoration projects, but you rarely, if ever, have a situation that the project could literally save a species from going extinct.
Well, the Community Foundation very early on, because it cares about New Jersey, one, knew that there were great needs as a result of Sandy. On the other hand, because the Community Foundation is made up of donor-advised funds, donors were saying, what can we do? We know we want to help, but we don't know what to do. So out of that came the Community Foundation's commitment to putting a fund of money together to help remediate what Sandy did. And it then joined with other foundations to set up this Sandy Restoration Fund. So it's a partner, it's helping its donors give its money away in a good fashion. And I think the collaboration is working so that Sandy's devastation is recognized as not just being houses torn down, but as you see here, an ecosystem being threatened. Well, so often it takes a long time to see the results of your giving, or you'll give it for a certain event and it's over and done with. This really is working right now to meet a need, because this is the one time that the birds and the crabs are together. But you also know that doing this and helping get this done means that there's a future for the ecosystem of New Jersey. I held the bird and took it to the next station where they do the blood test. It was very exciting. I think the other thing that it did for me, was that it made me appreciate the expertise that's involved, the dedication that's involved in solving a problem, in solving any kind of a problem. So I think that not only did it give me satisfaction, but it also gave me a new appreciation of how complex probably every issue connected with Sandy is.
I think the environmental aspects were important, but what was important also was the partnership between the contributors, the Duke Foundation, the Penn Foundation, Community Foundation of New Jersey, as well as the conservation groups. And very, very seldom do you see an opportunity to get involved in a cooperative effort with that many organizations.